My work over the last many years has been looking at sort of broadly the transformations of life, politics, and technology within what scientists and a lot of geographers are increasingly calling the Anthropocene. I know it's a term that has a lot of different meanings for a lot of different people, depending where you're coming from, and for some people it has no meaning at all. So let me give you a little definition of it to start. The term is being used to describe the time that we're living in right now on Earth. It comes from geology and the Earth system sciences and kind of has a little bit different meanings in each field. For me, the definition that I tend to be compelled by and to work with is more from the Earth system sciences, and it's sort of represented by this diagram here, which is from scientists Owen Gaffney and Will Steffen. This is a diagram from a larger paper that they put out in, I think, 2016, where they're trying to measure humanity's impact on Earth systems, especially over the last couple of hundred years. And so within their kind of definition and in the Earth system sciences more broadly, the Anthropocene refers to the Earth's moving out of the stable Holocene climates that most Western civilizations have developed within over the last 11,000 or so years. This sort of interglacial right here, and also moving out of the last 100,000 year cycle during which Earth moved from a glacial and interglacial back and forth onto a new trajectory, which you can see there, the Anthropocene trajectory, where the planet and its systems are heading towards sort of an unknown operating space. If the Holocene was the sort of safe operating space that most of civilizations developed within, we're on this sort of new trajectory defined by a question mark. Defined primarily and determined in the future primarily by climate change, carbon emissions, rising seas, and things of that nature. So in my view, I think the Anthropocene really pertains not only to the sort of dislocation and transformation of Earth systems themselves, environmental transformations that we're experiencing, but also to sort of the human realms of politics, technology, even ideas of truth, things like that. So we're seeing a lot of critical thinkers and geography and beyond sort of taking up the Anthropocene as a philosophical matter too during a time where modern categories of the human and nature are really sort of in upheaval and sort of increasingly imbricated with one another. So to get sort of a better handle on the Anthropocene and what it might mean to be in the specific point where we are now within it, I've been using over the last few years a concept that I take from ecological science, and in particular resilience ecology, which is called the adaptive cycle. So what's pictured here. It was developed in the 1970s by resilience father C.S. Halling. You may know him a little bit from hearing about resilience quite a bit. And the idea of the adaptive cycle is sort of behind a lot of ecologists' view of ecosystems and systems more broadly. They essentially think that every system, and everything is a system for them, every system, whether it's a human being, a city, or an ecosystem, passes through two phases of life, and the adaptive cycle kind of encompasses those two phases. So you have a front loop and a back loop. And I'm very interested in the back loop to preview what I'm going to talk about. The front loop is sort of the blue here, the back loop is the green. The front loop, broadly speaking, is a time of sort of passing from a stage of life sort of defined by rapid growth and transformation into a stability state defined by increasingly rigid structures and set kind of dynamics. For a very long time, ecologists, up until really Halling's work in the 70s, they thought that it was important to maintain ecosystems within that stability state. So in the front loop, they thought sort of that stability domain that developed was all there was to life, and it should be managed and perpetuated. Increasingly, after Halling, the view is that there's also a back loop stage to the life of a system. The back loop is a time where those structures that sort of constitute the stability domain come undone. It's a time of release, fragmentation, and great transformation. It's also a time of possibility. So a classic example that you hear about quite a bit to sort of illustrate the back loop and the front loop is a forest. So you think about a forest, the front loop phase would be sort of dominated by fast reproducing pioneer species that would colonize and exploit a fresh resource base of abundant materials. Over time, these would be replaced by more specialized organisms, which would annex the system's niches and nutrients. The result is a mature forest, which you can just imagine very, very easily, having probably been in one at some point in your life, dominated by a much more tightly connected sort of climax community of species in which sunlight, water, biomass, everything seems to sort of be in its place, as it were. Then a forest fire could, for example, occur. And during that time, those relationships that were seemingly sort of captured in place in the front loop get sort of scuttled and rearranged. Sometimes ecologists talk about it as a time when all the animals and nutrients and plants within the forest get put in a big mixing bowl and stirred. So it's a time of great upheaval and devastation, but also a time where new possibilities are opened up. So you might see new species able to take root that weren't able to before because of the canopy overhead blocking out sunlight from the lower parts of the forest, for example. You have potential for surviving species to create new sort of predator-prey relations with incoming species, and so on. So in short, it's a time of potential devastation and potential transformation. So in my work, I tend to think about the Anthropocene through this lens of the front and the back loop, just to sort of help us sort of triangulate maybe where we are within this Anthropocene trajectory more broadly. And this is an attempt to visualize that. I think we can sort of see the front loop of the Anthropocene within the sort of historical processes and transformations that are generally ascribed to the Anthropocene. So we have things like colonization, slavery, resource extraction, industrialization, proletarianization of the majority of the world's population, combustion of fossil fuels, and so on in the beginning of the front loop. Moving into the more recent globalization of the Western sort of capitalist, what John Law calls the one world world, founded in a sort of specific idea of what it is to be human and to relate to nature, based on sort of very, very modern Western definitions, as well as infrastructure and governance that sort of grounds and undergirds those social structures. And all of this, of course, within the stable climates of the Holocene, the stable climates, an ice cap on each pole, fresh water, clean air, so on. But I think where we are now is somewhere passing into the back loop. So the back loop is the time of climate change, rising seas, sort of fragmentation of these modern ways of thinking about what it is to be human in relation to nature and technology as well. So what I'm very interested in then, to get a little more concrete, what are the transformations underway in response to these back loop dislocations? In particular, my work has looked specifically at cities and coastal cities, home to the majority of the world's population, densely interconnected infrastructurally, coastal and therefore vulnerable to rising seas and natural disasters. The cities are increasingly construed by international bodies and designers and so on as sort of the front lines of climate change. I mean, I think we can sort of see them as first responders to the back loop as well, more broadly. These are more and more places where designers, planners, city governments, and so on are trying to ask the question, how to make the city more resilient to climate change and disruptions associated with it, like rising seas and flooding. So I think at least in my research, I've seen the rise of resilience as the sort of dominant discourse around cities in the time of rising seas since, let's say, 2012. It definitely has a longer history, but this is an image here of New York in 2012 when Hurricane Sandy hit and disrupted the majority of the infrastructures running the city. So you had a blackout throughout the lower part of Manhattan and parts of Queens and Staten Island. The subways were shut down and so on. It was a major event in the city, and it really brought the question of what to do about rising seas and hurricanes in coastal cities to the fore. Resilience quickly became the sort of buzzword. How to become resilient, in other words, how to keep the city afloat amidst disruptions like this. very, very emphasized is a matter of experimentation. What you heard over and over and what you continue to hear with regard to urban resilience is what kinds of technologies can we develop now that will be better able to deal with these types of disruptions. We can't use the old models. We can't sort of fight the last battle, as it were. We have to create new resilience infrastructures. So this is something I've looked at for quite a while in New York City, but increasingly I've been moving over the last year. My research, that looks odd. It's funny, you know, when you transfer a slide from one system to another. Well, there you go. That's two images of Miami instead of one. So increasingly, I've been moving my research to Miami, Florida, as you can see here. Miami, in some ways like New York, but in some ways more than New York, is construed as sort of ground zero for sea level rise in the United States and perhaps in the world. It's one of the most low-lying cities in the United States. The majority of the population lives below 4 feet sea level. I think it's the only comparative place is Louisiana, some cities in Louisiana. And you can kind of see here from this drone shot, it's very level with the water. So it's very vulnerable to flooding and to hurricanes. Miami also has sort of another problem that New York isn't having in the same way, which is sunny day flooding. So it's not only a matter of punctual events like Hurricane Sandy that Miami is experiencing that would cause flooding, but everyday types of flooding that occur when there's no rain or no storm in the vicinity, but only high tides. So this is occurring in part because the city is built on a foundation of porous limestone, which is sort of like, you know, like Swiss cheese or something, you know, or a sponge. So the water comes up from underneath the ground and through the gutters just as much as it does from the sides. So during annual king tides and high tides, you see this type of scenario in the city. This is an image that was taken, a famous image now, taken by a guy living in Miami Beach in 2016 of an octopus that he saw washed up in a parking garage. And this has been an image that circulates quite a lot just in the media and in sort of like social media to sort of express, you know, the canary in the coal mine, to use that phrase again, that Miami is seen as, and this octopus is increasingly called the canary in the coal mine, of the sort of watery future that the city faces. So you see a lot of focus in the media on the doomed nature of Miami and its condition. Goodbye Miami was a big story in Rolling Stone by Jeff Goodall. And there's been a number of things like this. You know, Miami should have never been built here. Miami is doomed, and so on and so forth. In this context, there's been sort of a convergence of elite institutions like Columbia, designers, funding organizations like the Rockefeller Foundation on the city in hopes of sort of developing new infrastructures, kind of capturing the grants to be the resilience partners in the city and so on. And again, just like in New York and in a lot of other places where urban resilience is being developed, infrastructure is a key concept here. The focus is essentially really what kind of resiliency infrastructures can be built. And it's being portrayed as sort of a laboratory for experimentation with resiliency infrastructures. You have these types of statements often from politicians and city planners, you know, there's no playbook for this. We're sort of writing the rules as we go. We have to figure it out, you know. And the, you know, politicians are being sort of portrayed as very courageous for taking up this challenge. So some examples of what is going on there. You have all over the city different types of infrastructures being developed, and I'm studying many of these, but to kind of focus in on one, since we have only a little time, in Miami Beach, specifically the city of Miami Beach, which is where I live, the former mayor, Phil Levine, who's this guy here, he laid out a $400 million infrastructure plan that he sort of is known for like ramming through since 2013 when he was in office through no bid contracts and so on, in hopes of, you know, really getting these things done and in place by the time he ran for governor this year. And he lost, by the way, but his hope was to have been sort of the next Al Gore climate change mayor, this type of thing. So the infrastructures that were built since 2013 under Levine's project include what you see here, which is a promotional shot that he made, but it's what it looks like in the Sunset Harbor neighborhood of Miami Beach, where they've elevated a bunch of the streets. So essentially what they've done is just taken the roads that are there surrounding this sort of condo district with, nice restaurants and very expensive gyms and so on, up several feet. So when you're in one of these restaurants or cafes, you used to be sitting like on the sidewalk, table beside the road type dining. Now you're 2.5 feet below the street, and you're kind of down there eating your food. You have like car exhaust sort of coming in type of thing. It's very elegant, And so these have actually been implemented in a number of areas in Miami Beach, and they're still being built. A whole plan is in place to raise many, many of the streets, and ultimately, I think all of them. They've also installed a series of pumps. There's about, I think, 60 planned. And these pumps essentially take the water, flood water, out of the streets and so on, and put it back into Biscayne Bay, which is adjacent to the island. And these two measures have been pretty effective, as it were. They also are putting in a number of seawalls. So just to give you a sense of where these are being built and what the neighborhood looks like, because it's easy to just think, okay, infrastructure, Miami Beach, okay, just another city, but this is a sort of random sample, speaking of the super wealthy, a random example of real estate if you go on Trulia in the area where they're doing these infrastructural upgrades. And I think this is not even the very high range of prices, it's just a normal price. And the type of wealth that you'll see in architecture and all that, it almost seems, the mansions that you see in some of your slides, they look so like modest and refined compared to some of what you'll see in these neighborhoods. You'll see like 2 tennis courts and a basketball court in the front, and then 6 houses and yachts and this type of thing. So that's the kind of resident that's in this area alongside large condo towers. So those are just a few infrastructures that are being built in Miami Beach to deal with rising seas and flooding. To me, the question that I'm asking with infrastructures like these is, what relationship do they have with the back loop? In what way do they relate to the back loop? How do they take it up, right? Because they don't deny it. The governor of Florida denies climate change exists. They don't do that. They accept the transformations of the back loop, but in their own particular way. So what does that look like? And I think we can ask, about the nature of these infrastructures in a number of ways. You could say, technically, how do we understand them? On a technical level, they have actually mitigated flooding quite a bit in some areas, others less. They have reduced a bit of street flooding. They've also caused a lot of unintended consequences. They have caused flooding into people's yards. So a lot of residents have protested the elevation of the streets, because when you elevate the streets but the homes are still here, you have flooding going into yards and so on. It's hard to connect up to the roads. There's been also a lot of protests from residents, which have even halted some of these projects in certain areas, because they think that they're ruining their property values, which is concern number one of all concerns in Miami Beach, and the aesthetic qualities of the neighborhood. They're worried about that too. The pumps have had even more problematic effects, which is, primarily they have had a major consequence of dumping fecal matter into the bay. And so polluting the bay, raising the levels of fecal matter beyond what even some of the scientific measurements can detect. And of course, well beyond acceptable limits for humans. They've also killed off a lot of the wildlife and the aquatic life that was living in those areas. Then there's yet another debacle that's ensued. The chief engineer who had been behind these projects was fired amidst a big scandal because he had built the seawalls without environmental permits. And so now they're having to be torn down and rebuilt and all of this. So there's some technical issues there. But that's really, in some sense, that's less my interest. My interest is also with infrastructure as sort of a political and social matter. I think we can see through infrastructure many things. Brian Larkin, the anthropologist, he says that infrastructure is political, but it's also poetic. We can see a lot about life and our lives through it. So in terms of how these infrastructures, what they say about human life at this point, and also how they relate to the back loop, I think with these in particular, these resiliency infrastructures, what we can see is that they are very specifically designed to support a particular way of life, you know. We can think about, you know, just the type of residents that live in this area as one place to begin. You know, the Trulia listing gives us one image. Some of the people who live on the road where the protests have halted the street elevations are J-Lo, Jennifer Lopez, Matt Damon had been there. Lil Wayne is just a little bit up. Nothing wrong with Lil Wayne, I'm just saying, to give you an idea of who's there. You know, big real estate brokers and so on are there too. You know, so and the thing about Miami and Miami Beach in particular is that it's amidst a huge building boom, an investment boom, which is always portrayed as just incredibly contradictory to the seas rising. You know, you have cranes everywhere and, you know, billions of dollars of investment going into new developments right on the coast. And the number one concern there is property values and making sure that investors and banks and so on don't start to write the city off, you know, and start to pull out, start to say this is not a viable investment. Because that's, you know, as you mentioned too, it's the very likely next step for some of the super wealthy. When they see that it's not a good investment opportunity, they'll just take their portfolio elsewhere, you know. So the city it's their main concern is to support that. So we hear a lot about these resiliency infrastructures as if they're sort of the, you know, this cutting edge, courageous innovation of the city. You know, the city's salvation will be found in these infrastructures. But they don't, you know, even if they're portrayed as different from, you know, let's say modern infrastructures, resiliency infrastructures, on the other hand, they don't replace modern infrastructures. They don't get rid of anything, you know, like the power plants, the nuclear power plant, which is just down the way, you know, all the pipelines, all the other infrastructure that's there. They're there to support it, and in some sense to support the effects that are generated. So in some sense, I think you can say that the role of these infrastructures is to manage the catastrophic effects of, let's say, front loop infrastructures through the back loop, so that the loop itself can kind of continue. In other words, it supports a particular financialized, profit-driven way of life, supported in the background by a service economy and service workers living further out in Miami. You know, and so then we can kind of see this idea it's sort of forwarding a single idea of Miami, a picture idea of Miami for tourists, you know, awash in sunlight on the beach, condos and investment and so on. And this is it's sort of a play I think we can find on the phrase Miami Forever, which is the name of a new $400 million general obligation bond passed by the former mayor of Miami, half of which is going to go to sea level rise infrastructure as well. So these resiliency infrastructures in some, I think we can see them as trying to create and sustain Miami forever, but a particular single version of Miami forever. I'm less interested in that. You know, I think the thing is, there's not one Miami. You know, that's one vision of Miami that we can see. The image that's on, you know, investor portfolios, the image that's on, you know, Instagram or whatever, but there are actually many Miamis. The Cuban artist living in Miami and the curator at the Institute of Contemporary Art there, Gene Marino, he writes in a beautiful piece about Miami, Miami is a series of geographies, a compendium of zones that seem to flourish independently. Well, of course, all cities are heterogeneous assemblages to some degree. Few in the US are nothing but parts that don't recognize each other. To navigate this geography requires many maps. The map that includes the new museums and the sprouting luxury condos, a zone awash in money, wildcat investments, and other jet-set attitudes that baffle the locals. But also the map that binds Miami to the Black Atlantic. Miami is the 21st district of Kingston, Jamaica, and part of Haiti's diasporic 10th department. Or the map, perhaps the newest one, of Cuban migration in the wake of the normalization of US-Cuba relations. And these maps, this listing of geographies could go on. Miami is very much known by people who live there as a city of cities, not one city. And I'm interested broadly in what might something like backloop urbanism developing there look like. But backloop urbanism won't be a single kind of urbanism. What I think is very interesting is that in Miami, you have a whole series of techniques and technologies being developed in response to transforming environments, and in particular for living with water. Each of these technologies, each of these infrastructures will forward its own trajectory in its own world in the same way that the resiliency infrastructures from Miami Beach do. And if there is to be a kind of backloop urbanism that might be developing in Miami, it's going to involve all of these, the sort of assemblage of all of them, overlapping, interconnecting, sometimes not connecting, and playing out together. So rather than just focus on these, sort of high-profile city projects like the ones in Miami Beach, which have promotional photos and so on, I think we can look at those, but I am also very interested in exploring some of the practices being developed by normal people, everyday people on the ground, sort of informal practices for living with water. And to conclude, I'll just tell you a few of those. Here, what you can see is an image of the Miccosukee water testing. So the Miccosukee are a Native American tribe who've been in South Florida for like the last 200 or so years. And they have a long history of living with water. It's not a new question for them. They've been living in the Everglades for quite some time, fishing and hunting and living on hammock islands there. More recently, they're developing new technologies for living with water because the Everglades have a lot of pollution and a lot of other quality problems. So every year they have an annual water monitoring event where they bring out everybody, like family, friends, anyone who wants to get involved. They bring out swamp buggies, which they build, and do like a whole day of water quality testing. And they've worked with some scientists to get these tools and equipment. And they teach kids and older people how to do it. They bring out, even like porta potties on airboats, so people can spend the whole day and really, get the work done. And this is a way for them to relate to the transforming conditions of their water environment, which is not the same as it was when they moved there, when they came there 200 years ago. But for them, they don't believe in disaster preparedness planning, they say. They just know that they're going to be there. So they have to figure out the infrastructures to do so. On a very different tip, there's a growing practice of paddleboard fishing and different types of use of paddleboards in the area, which is quite common now amongst a set of younger people. This is Brianne Drassi, who's someone I've been working with, who's teaching me how to do this as well. She's very cool. And she sort of pioneered this technique of using a rather inexpensive transportation device that can get you through, well, if you're in a flood time, through streets, but in a non-flood time, through canals, for fishing and sustaining oneself. And again, on another tip, this is a Cuban resident, Fane Losman, who has developed aquatic housing using his, as you can see sort of in this picture here, sort of a prefab suburban home, but just on a barge, this type of thing. And there's also a long tradition of building this type of architecture in the Miami region. So those are just a few examples, but there are many practices like this that both have a long history in Miami and that are being developed anew right now as conditions transform. So I'm very interested in these types of practices as well. This is, I think, going forward, the question of infrastructure, like Sage mentioned, is very important for ordinary people to think about how to live amidst these sort of backloop transformations that we do face and that are coming to be more severe over time, especially when infrastructures break down during storm events, and especially if investors and the super wealthy do at some point decide to abandon Miami, which very well may be the case. It may be sooner than later. So the question of local infrastructures and sort of autonomous infrastructures is a very important one. So to kind of explore this theme, I've been organizing an ongoing workshop with Jean Marino, the person I quoted before, the artist I quoted before. These sort of open workshops where people bring their own sort of tools for the back loop, such as the ones I just described, like aquatic housing or whatever the case may be. In each of those three examples will be people presenting. And the idea is to sort of bring these different back loop practices together, create encounters between them, but also to see what might come from discussing around them between very different types of people. And it's an experiment. We'll see. We'll see what happens. But in any case, I think that to conclude, the interesting possibilities for Miami reside in the intersection between these different practices of the back loop and the overlap of them, rather than reducing Miami's future down to a single vision of what life could be there. I'll stop then. Thanks.